Hello students, this is a short note on external jugular vein. So write a short note on external jugular vein and its applied anatomy. So in answer we may write like this: the external jugular vein is located on the side of the neck, okay, on lateral aspect of the neck. So the external jugular vein is located on the side of the neck and it runs in superficial fascia, just deep to the skin. There is superficial fascia, but in this region there is also presence of a subcutaneous muscle that is called as platysma. So though it is running in the superficial fascia but under cover of the platysma, and then it will cross to that of the sternomastoid muscle. That means most of its part will lie here in this diagram. If you see, it lie here, most of its part will lie on the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is to which it is crossing from the anterior to the posterior and inferior direction. So this external jugular vein, for the most of its parts, will lie on to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and after crossing this sternocleidomastoid muscle, okay, this will lie in the posterior triangle of the neck. We have already learned about the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid forms the anterior boundary of the posterior triangle, and the anterior margin of trapezius here in this region will form the posterior boundary of the posterior triangle. Okay, so within this triangle, then this external jugular vein will go and then it will pierce to the general investing layer of the deep fascia just above the clavicle. Okay, so this is how you can write about the external jugular vein into the, in the introduction of the short note, introduction of the short note. Let us see the formation of the external jugular vein, which we have covered in last videos also, but again see it here. It is formed below the auricle, okay, and behind that of the angle of the mandible, or in some cases below the angle of, and this is the region of the parotid gland, okay, it is, and from this will come out the vein, okay, from the posterior inferior margin of the parotid gland. Okay, so let us see the formation. It is formed below and behind the angle of the mandible by union of the posterior auricular vein. See this. This is the auricle, and behind this auricle, this is the posterior auricular vein. Okay, and this will join just below the auricle, behind the angle of the mandible, with that of the posterior division of the retromandibular vein. Okay, so this is the posterior division and the posterior auricular vein, they will unite to form the external jugular vein. Okay, so thus it is its formation. But before that, you see that this is the superficial temporal vein, which will join with that of the maxillary vein, and this will form the retromandibular vein, which lies behind the ramus of the mandible. Hence it is called as retromandibular vein in the substance of the parotid gland. And then this will divide into two branches or division, a posterior division which will run backward, and an anterior division of the retromandibular vein which will unite in the just above the angle of the mandible with that of the facial vein. And after the union of the facial vein, then it is called as the common facial vein. It will be either its union is in the just above the angle of the mandible or below the angle of the mandible. Okay, mostly below the angle of the mandible, this anterior division will unite with that of the facial vein to form the common facial vein, which will drain into the internal jugular vein, not shown in this diagram. Okay, so coming back to the formation, okay, by the union of posterior auricular and the posterior division of the retromandibular vein, This is how the external jugular vein is formed. Let us come to its termination. Excuse me. In the termination, this vein then will go into the posterior triangle, and that's to the supraclavicular part of the posterior triangle below the inferior belly of the omohyoid, where it will just open, or it will join as a tributary of the third part of the subclavian vein. Okay, just deep to the clavicle, just deep to the, so this is the site where it will terminate in the subclavian vein. So you have learned formation, then you have learned the termination. Now let us see its course between formation and its termination. Now the course is that after formation it descends downward and backward. See this, it is going downward and backwards on the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, and here it lies in superficial fascia. Okay, under cover of the platysma. Okay, under cover of the platysma. Now then about an inch above the clavicle, it will pierce the deep fascia here somewhere. It will pierce the, which is the general investing layer of the cervical fascia. So the deep fascia, it will pierce in the posterior triangle, that's supraclavicular part of, or subclavicular part of the posterior triangle. After piercing the fascia, this vein will go deep to the deep fascia, where it will open in the subclavian vein. Okay, and this opening will lie just posterior to the clavicle. Okay, or deep to the clavicle, posterior or deep to that clavicle. So this is the course of the this this external jugular vein. So partly it is in superficial fascia, and then its lower terminal part, it lies deep to deep fascia, which after piercing goes into the posterior triangle. Okay, become as a content of the posterior triangle in the lowermost part. Let us come to the tributaries of this. Okay, so what are the tributaries? See this, in this diagram I will show you the tributaries which are pouring the blood into the external jugular vein. Right. Now these tributaries are the transverse cervical vein. Here see this transverse cervical vein. Okay, then the supraclavicular vein, it is called as supraclavicular. Both will pour its blood into the external jugular vein in posterior triangle. And then there is another vein coming from anterior side, and this is called as the anterior jugular vein, which lies in the anterior triangle. Then it goes deep to the sternocleidomastoid, and then it opens into the external jugular vein. But just above the manubrium sterni, the anterior jugular vein of the right and anterior jugular of left, they will join each other to form jugular venous arch. Okay, just above the sternal notch, sternal in midline. Okay, but this is not our, I mean to say, we are dealing with this. Just I am telling you that this vein, that is the anterior jugular vein, will also open into the external jugular vein. External jugular vein. So these are the major tributaries. Then there may be a vein which may lie in front of the anterior margin of the trapezius, which is a tributaries of transverse cervical, and then there may be a tributaries lying posterior to that of the posterior margin of the sternocleidomastoid. So these are the tributaries of the external jugular vein. Okay, to the external jugular vein. Okay, before I proceed further, okay, that means to the applied anatomy, I will show you this diagram from the Theme Dissector. Okay, and this is the third volume written by me. Okay, and I am thankful to the Theme for showing this diagram to you. See here, this is the general investing layer of the deep fascia. That means we are, after removal of the skin, we are in the superficial fascia, where this external jugular vein, after its formation deep to the auricle and posterior to the angle of mandible on the margin of the parotid gland, is going down, crossing to the sternocleidomastoid, and then here just above the clavicle, about 1 inch above the clavicle, it is piercing to that of the deep fascia to go inside the posterior triangle as its content. This is the posterior margin of the sternocleidomastoid, and this is the anterior margin of the trapezius. Apex of the triangle is here, and this is the intermediate third of the clavicle is the base of the triangle. We have removed the roof of the posterior triangle, which was formed by the deep fascia or the general investing layer of the deep fascia. Now you can see the content of the posterior triangle, and in the floor you are seeing that it is covered by the muscles covered by that of the prevertebral fascia. And here you can see that from the posterior margin of the sternocleidomastoid, now here it is piercing, it must have pierced to come into the posterior triangle, and again here in posterior triangle the vein is piercing to the prevertebral fascia to go to the subclavian vein to drain into the subclavian. Now here the prevertebral fascia is seen here, okay, and then you can see that this is the external jugular vein, and here deep down is the subclavian vein, and this is the transverse cervical vein, the supra scapular vein, and this is the anterior jugular vein. Okay, this is the external and this was the anterior. So many tributaries, they are opening inside the external jugular vein. Okay, external jugular vein. Right, let us see the applied anatomy of the external jugular vein. Okay, applied anatomy of the external jugular vein, they are in relation to the venous pressure. Okay, because this vein is very superficial, just beneath the skin you can see this vein. Okay, if it is dilated, okay, this vein can be seen if it is dilated, and there is increase in the venous pressure, and that's why being a superficial vein is used to measure the venous pressure through the external jugular vein. And why it is needed to see the venous pressure of the external jugular vein? Because in most of the cases where there is increase in the external jugular pressure, it may be due to the obstruction of superior vena cava, because ultimately the brachiocephalic vein will form the superior vena cava, and if there is an obstruction of the superior vena cava, or if there is the failure of the heart, right heart means the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay, if they fail, that means there is something wrong with the lungs, so that the venous blood is not going properly, it is start collecting into the right heart, and that is called as the failure of the right heart, and this will naturally increase the pressure into the external jugular vein. Okay, external jugular vein, and that's why a dilated external jugular vein indicate that either there is a obstruction at the level of superior vena cava, or it is the failure of the right heart. Okay, then second applied importance here is in relation to that, if a external jugular vein is cut before it is penetrating to the general, investing layer of the deep fascia. See this is the deep fascia. Just zoom this diagram. Okay, and here I have just drawn, this is the deep fascia where the external jugular vein is penetrating, and then it will open into the subclavian vein, and just before it is penetrating to the deep fascia to go into the posterior triangle, and if it is cut here, then this cut edges of this external jugular vein will not retract, because the fibrous tissue of the deep fascia is attached here, so this cut end will remain open. Okay, and this may suck the air. Okay, it may suck the air, and the air will go into the large veins and then to the heart, and from heart this air may go to the various visceras, Okay, this is called as air embolism. Okay, where air is being taken to the various tissue, I mean say viscera, and there it will, I mean to say, obstruct the blood flow when it will go to the arteriolar level. Okay, and this will lead to the death of the tissue where air embolism is there. And if this large amount of the air embolism takes place into the brain, then that may cause the death also. So this was the applied importance of the external jugular vein. So we have covered the external jugular vein for the short note in the various headings: formation, termination, course, tributaries, and applied importance. Thank you very much for watching this short video.